Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today for a truly important conversation about the gun violence epidemic in America today. This is the second roundtable on gun violence that the Oversight Committee Democrats have held this Congress. I want to thank my colleagues who are en route from Florida, Congressman Maxwell Frost and Congressman Jared Moskowitz, for their involvement and their passionate commitment to ending gun violence. I want to recognize my colleagues who are here now, beginning with our distinguished colleague from Michigan, Rashida Tlaib, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's the delegate from the District of Columbia, and we've been joined also by our friend Lucy McBath from Florida. 2 weeks ago, in the immediate wake of the horrific school shooting in Winder, Georgia, my Democratic colleagues and I urged Chairman Comer to immediately convene a hearing on the epidemic of gun violence that is ravaging America. And our pleas for action have been met with complete and total silence from Chairman Comer and from the Republican majority. So far in 2024, there have been more than 400 mass shootings across the country, defined as shootings that kill or injure at least 4 people, not including the shooter himself. Yet this Congress, the majority has refused to hold a single hearing about any mass shooting, with a single exception, when one of the intended victims in the mass shooting was Donald Trump. The security of the former president and all presidential candidates is obviously critical in our society, and our bipartisan hearing spurred the bipartisan investigation into the mass shooting and assassination attempt of the former president. But what about the security of students and teachers in Georgia? What about the safety of children in Uvalde, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee? What about the people shopping at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, or a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, or worshipers at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, or at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania? We say that the lives of our children and our loved ones count just as much, and cry out for a serious congressional investigation and action. Every person in America deserves to live a life free from AR-15 attacks and gun violence, not just presidential candidates. In the face of stony-faced Republican refusal to do anything to improve public safety, we Democrats on the Oversight Committee have convened this roundtable to lift up the voices of people in communities all across America still living through America's gun violence epidemic. We hope to force our colleagues to acknowledge the staggering human, financial, medical, educational, and social costs of their decision simply to tolerate out-of-control gun violence in our country as a fact of life. Since the beginning of this Congress, there have been more than 1,000 American mass shootings that have claimed more than 1,000 lives and injured more than 4,300 people. And we have had 0 hearings on the general problem of gun violence. And these mass shootings represent just 1% of all the firearm violence taking place in our country. The gruesome reality is that firearms are the leading killer of children and teens in America, beating out car accidents, childhood disease, and even cancer. In 2022, we lost an average of 7 young people every single day from gun violence in our country. And while school shootings may account for only a small fraction of total gun violence, the continued attacks on our elementary and middle schools and high schools spread terror throughout our communities and are fundamentally changing the character of childhood in our society. Schools should be havens of intellectual and emotional growth, where our kids fall in love with learning and acquire the skills needed to become responsible adults and citizens. With rampant and random gun violence afflicting every state in the union, schools have instead become a locus of fear and anxiety for a so-called lockdown generation, where active shooter drills, random bloodshed, and community heartbreak have come to define the lives of hundreds of thousands of young Americans and their families. Even beyond the terrifying violence and gore that are standard fare on TV, there is far more to the picture than meets the eye. In countless communities, long after the TV cameras have left and the country's attention has shifted to the next bloody spectacle, the nightmare has just begun for parents, brothers and sisters, grandparents, and other grieving family members, bereaved loved ones, and classmates and teachers and friends left behind trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. In the months and years after a mass shooting, young people themselves injured or wounded in the attack experience continuing pain, trauma, fear, and disorientation, and struggle to hang on to what's left of their lives. Studies show that these victims are less likely to graduate from high school, to obtain a college degree, or even to find their place in the labor market compared to young people who have not lived so directly through the horrors of gun violence. In the year after getting shot and enduring a firearm injury, kids will experience not only violent interruption of their academic, athletic, extracurricular, and social lives, but substantial increases in psychiatric disorders and higher rates of alcohol and substance abuse. The parents, siblings, and family of a wounded gun violence survivor also experience a marked increase in psychiatric disorders themselves and are 75% more likely to seek mental health care than other people in the population. And that does not fully explain the fear and trauma these survivors experience every single day. The path to recovery is long and winding, and many will never fully recover. There's also an economic cost to our uniquely American gun violence epidemic, one that's borne by the schools themselves and surrounding communities that experience this violence. Research shows that gun violence costs the United States more than $550 billion every year, more than $500 billion a year that the gun dealers and the firearm manufacturers don't pay for. That's the equivalent of about 2.6% of our nation's GDP. Without meaningful common sense gun reform, Americans are paying more every year in taxes to pay for massive medical and hospital emergency room and long-term care costs, expensive school resources for security, building reinforcements and cleanup costs, huge criminal justice and first responder costs, just to name a few. Our panelists today will share their stories about what it means to live with the staggering and mostly invisible consequences of gun violence and the heartbreaking obstacles that they have encountered as they and their communities and families try to recover some semblance of normal life. They will share the experience with the overwhelming and enduring medical and psychiatric costs of a mass shooting and the psychological, emotional, educational, and financial complications of trying to address so much trauma, grief, and fear in their communities in the wake of gun violence. In addition to our other panelists, we have invited here today 3 principals from public schools that have suffered an episode of gun violence, and I want to thank them for really bringing this whole category of unexamined reality to my attention. It is critical for Americans to hear their stories, to understand that this is not over when they turn the TV cameras off, but this is a long-term struggle that takes place. They are going to tell us about the recovery process, what is needed to support the next school and community that suffers a shooting, what tips that they have. Anyone who thinks that a school community can suffer a mass AR-15 attack on Friday and then just dust themselves off over the weekend and be back in action on Monday is about to get an education into the real facts of life in America from the people who have dealt with gun violence and all of the subsequent effects of it. We're told that gun violence is just a fact of life in America. We're invited to believe nothing can be done about it. C'est la vie. Gun violence is before a fact of life, it's a fact of death in America, the leading cause of death for children and teenagers. But as you're about to see, it's indeed a fact of life too, for all of the injured, the wounded, the traumatized, and the broken-hearted people who struggle to hang on and survive in the wake of such a disaster. We, on the Democratic side, refuse to accept gun violence as an inevitable, melancholy fact of life or death in America. We must build a better and more peaceful nation for our children and for this lockdown generation. And I want to thank all of our panelists for coming today from across the country to be with us to bear witness to this extremely important topic.